I think today's conversation is incredibly special, Mohsin. I remember in one of the pieces in Civilization and Its Discontents, Mohsin writes, at the first ever Lahore Literary Festival held in February, the turnout was said to be 25,000. It was breathtaking. I can think of perhaps no public occasion in my 20 years as a novelist that I have enjoyed more than the talk I gave there. I won't say much more to introduce Mohsin, except that he's the finest ambassador we have for Pakistan. So please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Mohsin. Let's start at the very start. I want to start with the opening lines of The Last White Man. One morning, Anders, a white man, woke up to find he had turned a deep and undeniable brown. Now, obviously, most in the book looks at race as an imagined category, which you said is a strange imaginary game, but feels very real when played. And in a lot of your work, we also find you kind of asking this question of what moral and political assumptions might prove to be most fragile when we look back at them. Race, in this case, is one of the things that might prove to be so. So let's start by talking a little bit about the construct of race in the novel and how we might look back at our relationship with it retrospectively.
So the book is about a guy called Anders who wakes up one day and he's dark, and when he went to bed the night before he was light in skin color, and this sort of predicament begins to spread. And in some ways, I think the book had been sort of waiting for me for a while because, I mean, obviously I haven't changed color in my life, but I still remember what it felt like more than 20 years ago to be living in New York and London around the time of 9/11. And I think for many of us who lived in the States or in Britain at that time, you sort of went from being oftentimes this kind of ambiguous category. You weren't black, you weren't white, particularly in the US where there was a sort of racial binary of black people and white people, and then there were us sort of brown people who would kind of slip between. And then suddenly, almost overnight, one found oneself being looked at differently. You were being stopped at the airport, and you were being stopped at immigration, and you were nervous about, friends of mine had sort of FBI agents come to their houses, and it was a very strange time. And I remember, thinking that I haven't changed, but yet people are looking at me in this different way. And the funny thing is that even if you haven't changed, if you're the same person, if people look at you differently enough, you start to change, and you start to become a different person. So in some senses, it's not that Anders' experience is the experience of a Muslim man in New York around 9/11, but what that experience taught me was that we kind of make up our sense of identity as we go along. And often we don't even make up our own identity. It's sort of how people look at us that determines our identity. Do people look at you as a man? They look at you as a woman. They look at you as black or brown or white. And what do they think those things mean starts to shape it. So that had been sitting for a while. And then more recently, when we saw the rise of a kind of, racialized politics in so many places, like in the US with Trump, and in Britain with Brexit, which was, in theory, a vote against the European Union, but was also an expression of a kind of English nationalism as against a more, multiracial, multicultural Britishness. And you saw these trends. You see it next door in Modi's India. You see it in Turkey with Erdogan and the relationship to the Kurds. You're seeing it in China. You see it in Putin's Russia. And I felt like I wanted to sort of take this thing on and to examine this idea of race and to see how real it really is and what happens if you start to disassemble it.
Yeah. And I think that's a great segue, Mohsin, into the next question that I have, which is that the transformation in The Last White Man that Anders and other people eventually start experiencing is not something that gets instigated by a supernatural or magical moment. It is a kind of cultural, scientific, sociological moment. Talk to us a little bit about, and while I'm on that, actually, I should say exactly what you were saying, that it becomes it starts with skin color, but then all kinds of other transformations subsequently follow. Anders is haunted by this kind of double consciousness that you're talking about, his own sense of self, but also how others are perceiving him. Suddenly he feels he's taking up space. You know, the otherness kind of gets amplified, and I think he says he's been recast as a supporting character in his life. I want to ask you about this idea that human beings are changeable, vulnerable, and that our sense of self is quite shaky, especially when that change happens through a particular moment like this.
You know, we see it all the time. This idea that that our self is so vulnerable it can change all of a sudden. I mean, I gave the 9/11 example, but in Pakistan, you know, closer to home, we have this idea of of who is Muslim, who gets to call themselves Muslim, and what does it mean to be Muslim. And if one is sort of cut out the definition of Muslimness, what does that mean for you, for your personal safety, for your ability to be a Pakistani? And many times it gets defined by other people. You know, is something Muslim behavior? Is this person subscribed to Muslim beliefs? It's not a self-defined thing. It's something that other people define for you. And and so and so I think that that it's so strange echoes.
There is a strange echo.
Anyway, so what does that mean? It means basically that very often we experience this strange moment in our lives when everything has. Are you guys hearing something strange, or is it just?
Yeah.
Or, yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can
Okay,
hear you
good.
fine.
All right.
फेस्टिवल मौजूद है यहाँ पर एक साथी मेरे साथ मौजूद इनसे बात करते हैं ये सामने बताइएगा कि मेरी फेस्टिवल के बारे में आप क्या कहना चाहेंगे
I promise it's not.
Frequency connected. Frequency overlap. Transmission getting overlapped.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So, in a way, what we just experienced here, right? We were talking, and then this other voice sort of intruded on the conversation. I think that can happen with your identity too, right? That you're a sort of person living in your way with an interior conversation about who you are. And then suddenly something happens and that conversation changes. Other voices come into it. People look at you differently. A child grows up and suddenly starts being looked at as a young woman or as a boy, and everything changes. You discover something about yourself, and people start seeing that thing or seeing other than that thing. Everything changes. And in life, very often there are ruptures that occur that feel like magic. Somebody close to you dies, and it's impossible. Like, how can that person be gone? It's an inconceivable situation. And then it happens. So Anders is basically grappling with something like this. He's grappling with a situation where he doesn't want this to have happened. He doesn't want to be dark. He wants people to see himself as he was. He tries to act like he's white. And he discovers that people find that off-putting. He feels that acting white in a sense is like the opposite of being white. If you have to show people you're white and ask for acceptance through your whiteness, that isn't whiteness. And so Anders goes on this journey where he begins to change, and where he begins to find himself a different kind of person, and new ways of looking at things begin to open up. And I guess the last thing I'll say about this is, partly in my books, what I often do is I try to bend reality just very slightly. And the reason for that is because I think that reality isn't entirely real, right? That we make up reality as we go along. We sort of pretend that I'm Mohsin and you're Saba and we're like this, but we know that we're sort of pretending. We sometimes behave in a way that's terrible, and we say, I wasn't myself, but I was myself. It's just the story I tell about myself isn't entirely true. So I think in life we go through this existence pretending everything is real, knowing that it's kind of not entirely true. And in fiction, what happens is we can bend reality stories, and somehow that feels more true. That it feels in a way more like our actual existence. It lets us look at things with slightly different eyes.
And I want to come back to that architecture later, a little bit later in the conversation, Mohsin. Um, Speaking of the world around us, perhaps intentional or incidental, when we're reading The Last White Man, you can't help but when you see people changing color, the neighborhood kind of going through these changes, and the lockdown, it sort of invokes the pandemic somewhere, like I said, whether intentional or incidental. Were you writing the book through that time, and do you think at any stage that environment kind of seeped through a little bit?
Yeah, it's very much a pandemic novel. So in The Last White Man, what happens is that Anders wakes up dark, other people begin to wake up dark, and soon this thing spreads. And first it's, one person, and it's in some town far away. And then it comes closer and closer, and then somebody in your town has it, and then somebody you know has it, and then it begins to become, in a sense, contagious. Now, in the novel, it's not really explained why people are changing or what's happening, but it was written really in the time of the pandemic, and it felt to me like the pandemic. And in a sense, one thing which I guess has happened for me in the quarter century I've been, publishing novels, is I've started to, in a way, look at Lahore and my life in Pakistan, um, not as something necessarily to be described to other people, but as a source of its own kind of universals. In other words, that maybe Lahore or life in Pakistan isn't just this curious thing that you can describe to the rest of the world, but maybe in fact everywhere else in the world is a kind of echo of Lahore or Pakistan. And so the experience of having the pandemic come here and the way it shaped my life, in a sense, is a picture into what the whole world feels like. And the feeling over here of identity being, contingent and challenged, and people continuously sort of contesting who really is a Pakistani. What does it mean to be a Pakistani? Is something that is happening everywhere else too. And in the same way that in Pakistan we don't really have race as such. We have, religion as a very strong construct. We have gender. We have a pigmentocracy where being light in color is supposed to be better than being dark in color. Many people seem to act that way. But we don't have race in a Western sense. Now, that to me is really interesting because it may be that our situation, in fact, is the more normal situation. That the thing that's been invented in the West is something that is much less normal. Now, that doesn't mean that Pakistanis aren't racist. I think we're, as racist as anybody else. But I do think when you grow up in Pakistan, you wind up with a slightly different relationship to it. And the last thing I'll say about this is, I remember, talking to a kid in Houston in August when I was going around with this book, a Pakistani American kid, and I was talking, and he came up afterwards, and he said, you were talking about before 9/11 and how you felt pretty much accepted. He says, I can't even imagine that. Like, I've never felt accepted. And I thought he was going to say the opposite. I thought he was going to say, oh, that was so long ago, and now things are much better. He didn't say that at all. He said, look, I've always felt this weird, like, I'm this sort of Pakistani American or this Muslim, or, I just don't fit in. And his mother said, it makes me wonder if I should have brought him up in Pakistan, so he didn't have to deal with his stuff until he gets older. Now, I don't think there's any correct answer to that question of where somebody should grow up or what is better for a child or worse for a child. But I do think that it is a kind of gift to grow up not particularly racialized until you're old enough to think about it for yourself. And so in that sense, I guess for me, The Last White Man takes as a starting point a kind of Pakistani position, which is to say that, race isn't really that important, perhaps. It's not important enough for us to imagine it into existence with the kind of potency that America has imagined into existence. And so maybe if you start from a Pakistani position, you can wind up destabilizing this idea. I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but I think for me that was the journey into it.
Mohsin, I want to get into the characters. I want to start, as I was saying to you earlier, with Una's mother's character. And I've heard people ask Mohsin about this at other festivals, and sometimes it seems like she gets reduced to being racist. And I'm not saying she is or isn't, but to me it seems like there's a little bit more to her. Like there's this threatening loss of something, I suppose whiteness, privilege, whatever you want to call it. And it seems to me like that's something she's clinging on to. In many ways, a large source of her identity is from there. And eventually, it seems that might have to give. Yet, Mohsin, I find that you are creating a dignity around the idea of losing, even when the thing that you're losing perhaps shouldn't be dignified. And I find that really interesting. Talk to us about your way into the character of Una's mother. And please, may I ask you to also talk about her relationship with the internet, because I found that very interesting.
So about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it was very common to say that, young Muslim men are being radicalized by the internet, right? But it turns out that everybody is being radicalized by the internet, and these days, sort of, white pensioners in America and Britain are being radicalized by the internet. Anyone who uses the internet, particularly social media, experiences a potential sort of radicalization. Una's mom goes online and watches TV and starts to feel that, in a way that white people are losing their position in society, that they're sort of being erased, that her world is disappearing. And that is something that many of us should find familiar, because all over the world, people think that their people are sort of being erased, that their way of being is being erased. Whether it's traditional values in Pakistan, or whether it's, Islam, or Turkishness, or Russianness, or Hinduness. And then you see a kind of response to that. And almost everywhere what happens is people say that if you look at the future, our people are going to be wiped out, we're not going to be important, we're going to be in trouble. So turn away from the future. The place to look is the past. We should have a nostalgic politics that looks at some previous time as our greatest time and tries to bring that previous time back into existence, right? And so, next door in India, we see this happening very clearly, right, with Modi's Hindutva, which is an attempt to sort of say that there was this glorious sort of pre-Muslim, pre-colonial past of India, when India was truly this great place. And out of this, we can now forge a new and potent India. But it's grounded, in the past. And the same thing when Trump talks about, America, he's talking about sort of an America of the 1950s, which was had less immigrants or less non-white immigrants, and we see it really all over the place. In every country, every tradition, there's this desire to cling to your group, to sort of fetishize the more pure past, and to use that because you're terrified of what's going to happen. So Una's mother is doing this, right? She thinks that something terrible is happening to white people. She thinks that white people are being erased. In the novel, in a way, they are being erased. She's, as they say, she's paranoid, but she's not wrong. And so she's having this reaction to what's going on. And of course, you consider that's a racist reaction, in the sense that her view of the world is based on race and about being a white person, about the loss of power for white people and what that means. But it's also something to do with just being a human being at this moment in time on planet Earth. Because what we're seeing is that because of technology, the pace of change is accelerating. My childhood was much more like my parents' childhood or my grandparents' childhood. We would play outside in gardens in Lahore, and there was no real TV, and we often sat around at night with no visually. We have a candle and just sort of hanging out. There wasn't much to do. There was no internet. There were no imported goods almost in the shops. And my children are growing up staring at screens. My grandparents would have recognized my childhood as quite similar to theirs, but my children's childhood is completely different. And so I think because the pace of change is accelerating, we are becoming sort of unmoored. We're becoming unsettled. We feel uncomfortable. We're animals like any other animal, and our environment is changing so rapidly that we are developing a real sense of anxiety. And we're also seeing, our physical environment change. It's people are sunbathing in Washington D.C. right now, and it's snowing in Southern California, and we had these colossal floods, and people who were down, in southern Sindh when the rains happened, they said, they've never seen anything like this. It was volumes of water, several feet high, coming down from the sky, in a couple of hours. It's almost inconceivable to think that much water can be in the sky. So this is all happening, and so Una's mother is, in a way, all of us, right? She's feeling that things are changing. Now, the way that she reacts to that, what her response is, sort of clinging to her group and trying to sort of champion her group, may not be a choice that I would necessarily pick. But I don't think of Yuna's mother as a villain in any way. And also, I think the other part of it is, I tried to write a novel that had four main characters, all of whom were white. There's no sort of brown Pakistani guy who was sort of a stand-in for me. And to do this, I thought, I have to be each of these people. I want to imagine being them. And we can talk maybe later about whether it's right to write about people who are different from you and who gives you permission to write white people or white people to write brown people. But for me, it was very much the case that I wanted to, in a sense, inhabit Una's mother. So the Una's mother character that you see is me trying to be that person. And to be that person with sort of as much compassion and dignity as I can possibly muster. So I might disagree with what Una's mother believes, but I find it, for me, it's sort of, I guess, what I imagine I would believe if I was Una's mother.
And I want to bring in Anders' boss and I want to bring in his father and their reactions to Ander actually changing color. I think the boss sort of says that he'd kill himself or that he should kill himself. Are these people almost anesthetized to the humanity in themselves, or is there something more you could say about how they're responding?
Anders' father says that, Anders' boss, when he sees Anders and he's this transformed dark person, he says, wow, this happened to me, I will kill myself. That shouldn't be that hard for us to imagine. Look around us in Pakistan, right? If certain things happen to your dignity, to your sense of honor, so many people in Pakistan either kill themselves or kill somebody else in response. There is a feeling of sort of personal dignity and honor that so many people carry with them. And it may be, bound up in the behavior of the women of the family. It may be bound up in your sense of race. It may be bound up in whatever. But people seem very willing to entertain the idea that someone should die if certain kinds of dishonor are perpetrated, right? So Anders' boss is basically saying that now when it happens to him later on, he doesn't kill himself, right? It's easy to say that you will, and many fewer people actually do. But that's his reaction. Now Anders' father is different. Anders' father is sort of crushed when he sees Anders having changed, but he's crushed also because he recognizes that his son is now going to have a difficult life. And he's sad that he no longer sees his wife in his son. His wife, Anders' mother is dead, and Anders' father used to look at Anders and see it in a way, a reflection of his wife. But now he can't because he looks different. But Anders' father, he doesn't change anymore. He's very sick, he's dying. He has a different kind of mission. And in a sense, Anders' father's mission is, as he dies, as he's very, very sick, and as his life is coming to an end, his mission becomes, how do I pass on to my son, in a way, my values? And above all, in his values is the idea of, what would be a good death? How does one die well? And it's a question that so often we don't even ask ourselves, right? We can imagine what would be a good afterlife. We can also imagine what a good life would look like. But a good death is something that we very often turn away from. And Anders' father doesn't turn away from it. He looks at this question of what is a good death. And he thinks, look, I should die in a way that doesn't overly frighten my son. That shows my son that I've done it with dignity. That gives my son the strength to carry on when I'm gone and to face his own death with a degree of dignity. And so, in a sense, Anders' father is trying to pass on the basic essence of what he thinks he is, what his culture is, what his self is. And for me, in this moment, one thing which has happened in human culture generally is that we've turned away from this question, right? We have kind of stopped talking about what a good death is. We don't want to think about dying. We want to talk about other things. And so you see, horrors. You see people who blow themselves up and kill other people and imagine that's a good death, right? That's only possible in a way because we have completely abandoned any serious engagement with the idea of what, in moral terms, a good death actually is. We don't talk about it. And even when we have religious conversations, we tend to avoid that. We talk about other things. So in that sense, I guess Anders' father is a kind of spiritual quest that he's on, and that he's trying to communicate to his son.
And there's this one scene in the novel, Mohsin, where Una's mother is kind of waxing lyrical about the glory days when her family was white, and she's talking to her granddaughter. And the granddaughter simply says, "Stop," and she gives her a kiss. And there's a stillness about that moment, and there's a poignancy about that moment. Talk to us about that scene, Mohsin.
Yeah, sure. Actually, could I
Please.
just, because it's worth actually,
I was going to,
I don't know if you have time, but somewhere else, glasses. I'm going to it's just a sentence or two. It's a long sentence, but it's a sentence or two. Just that, so Una's mother is talking to her granddaughter, Una and Anders' kid. And this is what happens. Anders and Una did not speak too much of the past, but Una's mother, the girl's grandmother, did so far more, and tried to impart a sense of how it had been, of what they had really come from, of the whiteness that could no longer be seen, but was still a part of them. And the girl was fond of her grandmother, and remarkably tolerant of her grandmother. And so she surprised her grandmother when she stopped her one day, when she held her grandmother's hands and said, "Stop." That was all, just one word, "Stop." And it was not much, but it affected her grandmother deeply, because her grandmother could see that the girl was embarrassed, and not embarrassed for herself, but embarrassed for her, of her grandmother. And her grandmother felt a blaze of anger in that moment. But more than anger, she felt loss, a potent sense of loss. But the girl did not let go of her hands. She held on to them. She held on to them and watched the emotions flaming in her grandmother's eyes. And when the emotions had flamed for a while and were ebbing, were calmer, the girl brought her face down and kissed the papery skin of her grandmother's knuckle, soft lips, a hint of moisture, and she waited and waited until her grandmother finally shook her head and somehow smiled. So what's happening there is basically Una's mom is trying to tell her daughter that we were right and it was this great thing, and Una's daughter is sort of horrified. Like how can you say this stuff? That's in the past. We moved on. Like this race was a terrible thing, and she's trying to stop her grandmother from saying this thing which is horrifying to her. But she isn't withholding her love from her grandmother. She's saying, "Don't do this. It's beneath you. I know you're angry at me for saying this, but I still love you." And the grandmother, in a sense, is touched by this. And I think partly it has to do for me, with what human change is like. We imagine that we change and that that Pakistanis become more liberal or less liberal, or Americans become more this or more that. I think a lot of what changes is just that one generation passes on and a new one grows up. Maybe we don't change that much. Maybe it's the passing of generations that is where change happens. That young people growing up in Pakistan today will have a very different view than people who grew up in my time. And as they grow up, they'll create a different culture for this place. And so, in a way, the question then becomes, how do we manage this loss with dignity? And one part of that dignity is Anders' father's sort of looking clear-eyed at his own death and trying to master it to the degree he can, or master his own fear of it, as an act of love to his son. But the other one, which is in a sense the honor or the dignity or the generosity that we parents can give to our children. But there's another side of that, which is the honor and dignity that our children can give to us, right? Which is a dignity of a kind of forgiveness, which is to say that yes, in your time you thought this way, and I don't think this way, but I still love you, and I think that, in a sense, movement. How do we get to something where we let go of these tyrannies of race it requires, in a way, compassion in both of those directions. It requires compassion from those who are older towards a future that they don't like, and compassion from those who are younger towards a past that they don't necessarily like. And that scene is really about the second part.
And then there's Una Mohsin, who adapts to. It's going to come to Una because she's someone obviously who adapts to Anders' new identity a little bit better. I mean, definitely better. And there's a scene where she's actually applying makeup to try darker skin herself. Yet at the same time, she's straddling this other world of her mother, and she realizes in some ways why her mother is reacting the way she is. Talk to us about getting into Una's character and getting into her headspace and this particular scene where she's applying that makeup.
So Una's a young woman. She's lost her brother and has moved back to the small town to take care of her mother, who's this, quite anxious, quite depressed, and physically no longer fully well woman. And Una was in the big city and was sort of excited about her life there, but now has come back and is sort of in a family context, living with her mother. In that way, I suppose you could say Una is not so different from so many of us who live somewhere else, whether it's Karachi or Islamabad or New York or London, and then move back to Lahore and living with our families. It's a story that so many of us will have participated, or we've known people who lived a life like that, and was grappling with that. The return to this small town, this immersion in this life with her mother. And for me, again, writing Una was sort of about trying to be her. And I think one of the really important aspects of fiction, which we don't maybe talk enough about, is that we think that fiction is, primarily a kind of representational act, right? That if you're a writer, you are representing your people or your country or your type of person. And of course, to a certain degree, you are, and there's so much very important, powerful literature, which is literature grounded in representation, particularly of groups that are oppressed and that face, horrific misunderstandings and terrible conditions. But there's another side of fiction, and that side of fiction is what we might call a kind of transgressive side, right? That's a side of fiction which is, what is it like to be somebody else? What's it like if I'm a man to be a woman? What's it like if I'm old to be young, or if I'm young to be old? If I'm brown to be white, or as my son prefers. What's it like to be a Tyrannosaurus Rex? Right? What's it like to be Godzilla? What's it like? He's a little bit bigger now, but he used to appear in my study and roar and do all these things. And every child seems to do this. We all get together as children and we sit with our cousins or our friends and we say, okay, we're now pirates, or this is a tea party, or we're astronauts or something. And then we imagine that we're in this different place. And when we grow up, we are supposed to stop doing that. It's considered childish, and so we don't really. But as a novelist, partly what I do, what I think writers do when we're making characters, many of us do this, is we're playing that game again. You get to play astronaut, and you get to play tea party, and you get to play pirate, but this time you're doing it in your imagination. But you're not playing it by yourself. You're actually playing it with somebody else, and that somebody else is the reader. The reader is there years in the future, not in the same room, picking up this book, and they are going to now play make-believe with you. And so for me, becoming Una, in a way, to write the character Una, goes alongside a reader picking up the book and also becoming Anders and Una and playing, in a sense, this imagination game together. And I think it's very important to what fiction can do. People say that television and film are, these dominant forms, and that they're the main way of telling stories. And of course, they are the dominant forms. But they do something different. When you look at a TV show or a film, you see the world, and it looks like the world. And when you open a book, you see these little symbols, letters, punctuation marks on a white field, and you, the reader, think that the writer has given you these characters, but actually you are taking these little symbols and making the book in your imagination. And so readers are very much playing a kind of game of make believe. They're making the kind of half novel that novel writes, the novelist writes. And that's what the power of fiction for me, in a sense, really continues to have. You know, oral and word-based storytelling and written storytelling has the power of getting two people together, writer and reader, to play make-believe together, to imagine this new world into existence. And that has incredible power to change how we think about things. Because it's not that I've told you the story of the last white man. You have made up the story of the last white man using some prompts that I've put into this book. And when you do that, you can't help but be changed. You know, the same way that when you and your friends played Pirate or you played Tea Party, something did change. You became a little bit more confident, or you became a little bit more intrigued, you became a little bit more curious or something. It wasn't that we just played these games and nothing happened. We became different people by playing these games. So I think for me that's a huge part of what fiction does. And when we say, you know, are you representing Pakistan in a good way or whatever, that's only one aspect of how we can think about fiction. The other part of it is, are you inviting people to play make-believe with you, the way we did as children, in a way that leaves both of you, reader and writer, you know, changed by the experience.
I was going to ask you about that, so I'm really glad you brought that up, and I'm about to open to the floor, but I have to ask Mohsin a couple of last quick questions. Mohsin, you've described The Last White Man as a kind of Sufi novel, and I want to bring in this point specifically to talk about hope and, you know, keeping that flicker alive. You've described pessimism as a kind of surrender almost. Talk to us about, you spoke a little bit earlier on this, but talk to us about not groping in the past for a return to some nostalgic past, but rather to move forward and do so with hope. Why is it important, even in a novel like this, to keep it hopeful? And are there elements of your personal journey, fatherhood, other things that might have fed into thinking like that and wanting to bring that in?
Yeah, I think that you know, these days in Pakistan it's so easy to be lacking in hope, right? I mean, things. I think for most of us, we don't look around thinking that things are fantastic. And when I tell my friends in other countries, oh, you know, I'm really worried about things in Pakistan, they'll say, well, I'm really worried about things here in Brazil or in the Philippines or in America or whatever. I think all over the world we're gripped by this sort of loss of optimism. And I think that's very dangerous because I think it does bring into existence this kind of populist, nostalgic politics, right? Of in-groups and out-groups and going back to the past and fetishizing purity and these sorts of things. But unless we can be somehow optimistic, we have no antidote to that. And I think the optimism has to be, well, can we imagine something better that could possibly exist? I think for many of us, it's easy to imagine, for example, a better Pakistan, right? And we can even almost imagine it existing. The question we have to ask is, why doesn't that country seem to come into existence? Like, what's stopping it from coming into existence? But on the issue of race or migration, which is the topics of The Last White Man and Exit West, in a way, both of those novels are novels about a kind of apocalypse, right? The end of borders in Exit West and the end of racial divisions or racial categories in The Last White Man. And people often think that these are sort of horrors, or some people think so. But the novels, I guess, are exploring the idea that, you know, what if these things aren't horrible? You know, what if in fact they're the birth of something new? And so I guess one of the things that I'm very interested in, and I think fiction can do, is begin to imagine futures that are somewhat attractive, that we might actually like. Because if we don't do that, we really are left at the mercy of the nostalgists and the popular.
My last question, Mohsin, to you is that in the same book I referenced earlier, which is a collection of different essays, you write, things in the country around me these past few years have been mixed. Much is horrible, much is beautiful, and much is in between. And obviously this was several years ago. I want to wrap and open to the floor, Mohsin, by asking you, what is Mohsin Hamid's relationship with Pakistan and with Lahore?
you know, I can't answer that very quickly in the 1 minute we have, but it's almost easier to talk about, my if I look at my daughter's relation. So, if I said if I when I say to her, so okay, what if we were to live somewhere else? How about if we went to New York, or we went to this place or that place? Because whenever I travel, I kind of fantasize about living in the place I go to. And she says, look, you can go, but I'm staying with my grandparents. And I think that for so many of us from Pakistan or from Lahore, there's the feeling that we can go. But if we go, emotionally, a part of us will always stay with our grandparents. And I think that pretty much sums up my